Colonel Michael Harrison stood in the operations tent at Long Bin in December 1967 and reviewed after-action reports from recent combat engagements involving Australian infantry units. The reports documented something that Harrison found remarkable. When Australian infantry units were engaged by enemy forces, the Australian units did not withdraw or retreat. The Australian units held their positions against overwhelming odds. One particular after-action report documented an engagement where an Australian company, numbering approximately 120 soldiers, had been attacked by an estimated Viet Cong force of approximately 300 soldiers. The Australian company had not withdrawn. The Australian company had held its position, had called for supporting fire, and had repelled the Viet Cong attack. The Australian company had suffered significant casualties. 23 Australian soldiers had been killed or wounded. But the Australian company had held its position. The Viet Cong force had retreated. The engagement had been classified as an Australian victory. This pattern repeated in multiple after-action reports. When Australian infantry units came under attack, they held their positions rather than withdrawing. They held positions against odds that would have justified withdrawal. They held positions until supporting fire could be brought to bear or until reinforcements could arrive.
This pattern was markedly different from the pattern Harrison observed in American combat engagements. American units, when attacked by superior forces, often withdrew to establish more defensible positions. American units called for air support or artillery support and conducted withdrawal operations while the supporting fire engaged the enemy. The Australian approach was fundamentally different. Australian units held their positions. Australian units endured the attack while holding position. Australian units called for supporting fire while maintaining their position. Harrison requested a meeting with the Australian liaison officer to understand the rationale for this approach. The Australian officer, Major Peter Ashford, explained the methodology with clinical precision. When you hold your position, you deny the enemy the ability to achieve his objective. When you withdraw, you allow the enemy to take your position and to continue advancing. Holding position, even against superior forces, can be more effective than withdrawing because it forces the enemy to maintain pressure on your position rather than allowing the enemy to advance. Harrison listened to this explanation and recognized something significant. The Australian approach to defensive combat was based on a different understanding of what constituted effective defense. American defensive doctrine emphasized preventing casualty through withdrawal and the use of superior firepower applied from protected positions.
Australian defensive doctrine emphasized denying the enemy his objective by holding position regardless of casualties. These were fundamentally different approaches to the problem of defensive combat. But the results suggested that the Australian approach was effective. Australian units that held their positions against superior forces were ultimately successful in repelling the enemy. Australian units that held their positions suffered higher casualty rates than units that withdrew. But Australian units that held their positions prevented the enemy from achieving his objectives. By early 1968, this Australian methodology of holding positions against superior forces had begun to attract attention among American military observers. American commanders recognized that the Australian approach produced results, even though the approach resulted in higher casualty rates. This created a tension between two different measures of military effectiveness. By one measure, effectiveness was minimizing casualties. By another measure, effectiveness was preventing the enemy from achieving his objectives. The Australian approach prioritized preventing the enemy from achieving objectives over minimizing casualties. American doctrine more often prioritized minimizing casualties. Colonel Harrison began to advocate for American units to adopt aspects of the Australian methodology.
Harrison argued that American units that held their positions against attacks
would ultimately be more effective than American units that withdrew. But this advocacy faced resistance from American military leadership. American commanders were reluctant to adopt methodology that would result in higher casualty rates, even if the methodology resulted in greater overall effectiveness. By spring 1968, the debate about the Australian methodology of holding positions against superior forces had become part of broader discussions about American military strategy and tactical effectiveness. One American commander, Captain Robert Hayes, conducted an experiment where he trained his company in the Australian methodology of holding positions against attacks. Hayes briefed his soldiers on the rationale for the methodology. Hayes explained that when units hold their positions, they deny the enemy his objective. When Hayes's company came under attack several weeks later, the company held its position against an enemy force that was estimated to be larger than the American company. The American company held its position while calling for supporting fire. The American company repelled the enemy attack. The after-action report for the engagement noted that Hayes's company had suffered higher casualties than would have been expected if the company had withdrawn. But the company had successfully repelled the enemy attack and had prevented the enemy from achieving his objective. Hayes's report on the engagement became part of the broader discussion about the Australian methodology. Hayes explicitly credited the Australian methodology for the successful defense against the enemy attack. By mid-1968, American military leadership had accepted that the Australian methodology of holding positions against superior forces produced measurable results. American units throughout Vietnam were beginning to be trained in aspects of the Australian methodology, but the methodology was not universally adopted. Many American commanders continued to prefer withdrawal and the use of supporting fire applied from protected positions. The methodology remained controversial because it resulted in higher casualty rates. By 1969, the Australian methodology of holding positions against superior forces had become standard practice for American Special Operations units and for selected American infantry units. But the methodology remained less common in conventional American units. The phrase, "they don't pull out easily," became standard terminology among American commanders for describing the Australian methodology. American commanders would tell their soldiers, "The Australians don't pull out easily. They hold their positions."
We need to develop the same capability. By the time the Vietnam War was winding down in 1970 and 1971, the Australian methodology of holding positions against superior forces had become part of American military culture, particularly in special operations units. The methodology remained controversial because it resulted in higher casualty rates. But the methodology also produced measurable results in terms of preventing the enemy from achieving his objectives and in terms of maintaining control of territory. Major Peter Ashford, the Australian officer who had explained the methodology to American commanders, observed the adoption of the methodology with quiet satisfaction. The Americans are learning that holding position requires courage, but produces results. That is the lesson that matters. By the year 2000, American military doctrines still reflected aspects of the Australian methodology. American military personnel understood that holding positions against superior forces could be more effective than withdrawing, even though holding positions resulted in higher casualty rates. The principle that they don't pull out easily had become part of American military culture. The principle had been attributed to Australian methodology, although the specific origins were not always explicitly acknowledged. Military academies taught the principle using examples from the Vietnam War.
Students at military academies learned that holding positions against superior forces could achieve military objectives that withdrawal would not achieve. One Army War College instructor described the principle to students. The Australians understood that holding position against superior forces could be more effective than withdrawing. This understanding seems counterintuitive because holding position results in higher casualties. But holding position denies the enemy his objective. Withdrawal allows the enemy to take your position and to continue advancing. The Australian methodology prioritized denying the enemy his objective over minimizing casualties. This methodology produced results. The slouch hat represented Australian military effectiveness in tactical operations. The hold-fast tactic represented something different. It represented Australian understanding of how to conduct effective defensive combat against superior forces. These represented different kinds of Australian influence on American military operations in Vietnam. Both influenced how American military personnel conducted operations. By the year 2020, more than 50 years after Ashford had explained the Australian methodology to American commanders, American military personnel were still using the principle that holding positions against superior forces could be more effective than withdrawing.
One special operations officer, when interviewed about the principles of defensive combat, cited the Australian methodology. The Australians taught us that holding your position is sometimes more important than minimizing casualties. Holding your position denies the enemy his objective. That principle remains as relevant today as it was in Vietnam. The slouch hat had become an icon of Australian military culture. The principle of holding positions against superior forces had become a principle of American military doctrine. Both represented the Australian presence in Vietnam and the Australian influence on American military thinking. Sergeant William Torrance, the Australian soldier whose physique had impressed female American officers, was also known for his willingness to hold positions against superior forces. Torrance had participated in multiple engagements where Australian units had held their positions against Viet Cong attacks. Torrance had been praised for his courage and his refusal to retreat under fire. When Torrance was interviewed years later about his military service, he reflected on the Australian approach to defensive combat. "We held our positions because holding our positions was the right thing to do," Torrance said. "We did not retreat because retreat would allow the enemy to take our position. Holding position meant accepting casualties, but accepting casualties was better than allowing the enemy to achieve his objective." That was how we thought about warfare. This reflection captured something essential about the Australian approach to defensive combat. The approach was based on a clear understanding of what constituted military effectiveness. Effectiveness was preventing the enemy from achieving his objective, not minimizing casualties. By the year 2025, the Australian methodology of holding positions against superior forces had been incorporated so thoroughly into American military doctrine that its Australian origins were often not explicitly acknowledged. But the principle remained. The phrase, "they don't pull out easily," remained. The understanding that holding positions against superior forces could achieve military objectives remained. All of it traced back to 1967, when an American colonel had observed that Australian units held their positions against superior forces while American units withdrew. All of it traced back to briefings conducted by an Australian major who had explained the rationale for holding positions against superior forces. That explanation, initially resisted by many American commanders because it resulted in higher casualty rates, had eventually been accepted and had been integrated into American military doctrine. The Australian influence, visible in the slouch hat, was also present in less visible but equally important aspects of military operations. The Australian influence on how American forces conducted defensive combat persisted long after the slouch hat had become a historical artifact. The slouch hat represented visibility. The hold-fast tactic represented the deeper understanding of military effectiveness that the Australians had developed and had shared with the Americans. Both had shaped how the American military evolved in response to the Australian presence in Vietnam.